Welcome back to the night transmission. Tonight's story is a little different from our previous episodes. We've talked about the strange things in the sky, possible UFOs, historical mysteries, but tonight we're talking about something much closer to home. Something that actually happened. A story involving two 12-year-old girls, an internet horror character, and a crime that shocked the entire world. And honestly, the reason this story creeps me out isn't because of Slender Man. It's because Slender Man isn't real. Or at least, he wasn't supposed to be. So, before we start, I do gotta ask you guys, do you guys remember Slender Man? I feel like if you were like online in the late 2000s or early 2010s, like I was, there was no escaping him. YouTube videos, creepypastas, forum posts, fan art, games. He was everywhere, and for most people, it was just a scary story, or as some people say, like creepypasta. Something you'd read late at night and then forget about. But for two girls in Wisconsin, it became something much more dangerous. Before we get into the case itself, let's talk about where Slenderman came from, because a lot of people assume he comes from some ancient legend or folklore or a haunted story passed down through generations. Nope. Slenderman was literally created on the internet, which honestly makes this whole thing like even crazier. Back in 2009, there was a Photoshop contest online. People were challenged to create paranormal images. One user created this edited photos showing a tall, faceless figure standing in the background, usually near children. The photos looked creepy, and people loved them. I'm gonna put them up really quick. The only two that I remember that were like very popular are these. There's one with the playground, and then there's one where it's just a bunch of kids, I guess, lined up, and Slenderman's in the back. And from there, the internet basically did what the internet does. People started adding stories and more stories and videos and games. Eventually, Slenderman became the giant collaborative horror character. It's kind of weird when you think about it, that everyone like literally like helped create him. And I think that's what made him feel different. He wasn't one person's monster anymore. The internet turned him into something bigger, something that genuinely felt real. Now, let's talk about the two girls at the center of the story, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weir, both 12 years old, both fascinated by horror stories, both heavily interested in Slenderman. At first, it sounds pretty normal. I mean, honestly, when I was younger, I was obsessed with creepy stories and creepypastas. I think a lot of us really were. The difference is that at some point, their interest became belief. And this is where things started getting uncomfortable. Because according to the later interviews and police reports, they genuinely started believing Slenderman existed. Not as a character, not as a fictional story, as a real entity, a real being, something that could watch them, something that could punish them, something they literally feared. And that's honestly terrifying. But here's my question. Where is the line? At what point does imagination become belief? Because kids believe weird things all the time. Imaginary friends, ghosts, urban legends. But this went much further than that. On May 31st, 2014, the girls invited their friend Peyton Lutner to celebrate a birthday. Everything seemed normal. They had a sleepover. They laughed. They played together, hung out. Nothing seemed unusual. The next morning, they went to a local park. Eventually, they entered a wooded area, and that's where everything changed. Morgan attacked Peyton with a knife 19 times. Yes, 19. And honestly, every time I read that number, it shocks me, because there weren't any adults. These were children. After the attack, the girls just left her there, believing that she would just die. That's literally horrible. Like, imagine, these were your friends, and you trusted them. And on the day after your birthday? That's disgusting. It gets even crazier. Peyton survived. I know. Peyton survived, even after all of those stab wounds. Somehow, despite those severe injuries and losing a lot of blood, And being left alone, she managed to crawl toward a nearby road. A cyclist eventually found her, and that cyclist probably saved her life, literally. Like, that's actually incredible. It is. Because by all accounts, she shouldn't have survived. Yes, she did. Now, here's where the story becomes truly unsettling. Police eventually found Morgan and Anissa walking along a highway. When questioned, they admitted what happened. And when investigators asked why, their answers shocked everyone. They said, Slenderman. They claimed they were trying to become Slenderman's proxies. Basically, followers or servants. They believed that if they carried out the attack, they would earn his approval. And if they didn't, they believed he might harm them or their families. Do you guys actually believe that? Because honestly, that's the question that sits at the center of this entire case, and people still debate it. It literally became one of the biggest controversies. And I'll explain why. So this is where things become much more complicated than just quote-unquote kids did something terrible. Because investigators eventually discovered Morgan was experiencing serious mental health issues. She was later diagnosed with early onset schizophrenia, which changes the conversation completely. Because now you're not just talking about internet stories, you're talking about mental illness, reality, perception, and belief, and how all of those things interact with each other. Some people blamed Slenderman, others blamed the internet, others argued that mental illness played the biggest role. And honestly, I think this is why the case became so controversial, because there wasn't one easy answer. I remember when this happened, my mom actually told me. I remember vividly, she talked to me after school. I think I was either in elementary or middle school. My mom and I were into that horror stuff, so we're always watching scary videos, the creepypastas, always interested in things like that, because that's what we used to do when I used to live with her. We would just stay up at night watching scary videos until we passed out. So back onto the topic. People were freaking out. News stations were running stories everywhere. Parents were worried. People started asking whether horror stories online were dangerous, whether creepypastas should even exist, whether internet culture was influencing children. And honestly, I feel like people always look for something to blame nowadays. So, but why? Because we've seen this before. Video games, music, movies, the internet. Whenever something terrible happens, people want one thing they can point at and say, that's the reason. But reality is usually more complicated. Personally, I don't think Slenderman caused this. I think Slenderman became part of a much bigger situation. Mental illness, childhood imagination, isolation, fear. It's a character that happened to be available for those fears to attach themselves to. But that's just my opinion. Because at the end of the day, none of us can truly know what was happening inside their minds. So, this is probably the biggest question in this entire case. Did those girls actually believe that Slenderman was real? Because going back to when I had first heard this story many years ago, I assumed the answer was no. I thought maybe they were using Slenderman as an excuse, or they're trying to, turn people into, what is it? Not turn people, but I think it was trying to, the paranoia thing, right? They were trying to cause paranoia. Something, to tell the police after the fact. But the more I looked into it, the less sure I became. Why? Because of how consistent they were. Even after being caught, even after being separated, when talking to investigators, they continued talking about Slenderman as if he existed. Not like a character, not like a joke, like an actual being, like an actual entity. And that makes me a little uncomfortable. Because if they were making it up, you'd expect their stories to fall apart. Instead, they seemed genuinely convinced. And that's where I started kind of questioning. How do you even tell the difference between imagination and belief? Especially at 12 years old, dude. 12 fucking years old. And that's a really good question. Because when we're kids, we believe all kinds of things: monsters under the bed, ghosts, urban legends, imaginary friends. Most of us eventually grow out of it. But what happens when someone doesn't? Or what happens when those beliefs become reinforced by other factors? That's where this story becomes less about Slenderman and more about the human mind. Because your brain can literally play tricks on you, and that's been scientifically proven. There's been moments where, let's say, if I can give you guys a small story, there was a one time where I was little. I had woken up like maybe 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was laying in my bed. I didn't want to move, and my mom at the time, I used to share a bed with her, but she was showering because she was getting ready for work. What to me felt like, I heard like running outside the window, but it felt like a dinosaur, like stomps. I felt like maybe it was in my head, and maybe my brain was trying to play tricks with me, but I don't know. It's something I still talk about to this day, because what if like it really was my brain, or what if I really lived through that experience and like witnessed something that I shouldn't have? But anyways, um I have another question that I kept asking myself while researching this, and I want to like ask you guys this, and if you guys would love to leave a little comment down below. Do you guys feel like this could like happen today? Like if something like this would happen today, like would it be believable? I personally think so. Maybe not specifically Slenderman, but the internet is full of communities built around stories, conspiracies, and sometimes people get pulled into them. We've seen it happen over and over again. People find a community, they spend more and more time in it, and eventually they start believing things they never would have believed before. And when you're young, it's even easier, because as kids, you're kind of like still figuring out what's real, what's fiction, what's satire, what's serious, and honestly, sometimes adults aren't much better. And that's the truth. So, while the details of this case are unique, I think the bigger lesson is still relevant today. Not because of Slenderman, but because of how powerful ideas can become. Something else that stood out to me is that Slenderman might be one of the first truly internet created monsters. And that's actually kind of scary. Think about it. Most monsters come from folklore: vampires, werewolves, ghost stories. Those things have existed for centuries, but Slenderman, he was born online. Forums, Photoshop edits, message boards, YouTube videos. The internet literally created its own urban legend. And somehow it became one of the most famous ones ever. People were making documentaries, games, fan art. The character exploded. And what's fascinating is that millions of people understood it was fiction. But somehow along the way, for a small number of people, fiction stopped feeling fictional. And I think that's one of the reasons the story still gets talked about. Because it was one of the first times people realized an internet myth could have real world consequences. So let's say for a second that Slenderman isn't the scary part of the story. What's actually the scariest part? For me, it's the fact that there isn't a simple answer. It would honestly be easier if we could point at one thing, one cause, one explanation. But that's not how real life works. Instead, we get this mix of childhood belief, mental illness, internet culture, friendships, dynamic, and fear. And somehow, all of those things collided into one terrible event. That's what sticks with me. Not the monster. The reality. The Slenderman stabbing isn't really a story about a monster. It's a story about belief. About how powerful ideas can become. About the difference between fiction and reality. And about what can happen when that line begins to disappear. Because Slenderman wasn't real. but the consequences were a real victim, real families, real lives changed forever. I think that's much scarier than any monster could ever be. One thing I will say though is I really hope that Peyton is doing well. I hope she has friends that she can really trust. Even though, she has to live with that trauma of what happens to her on her birthday or the day after her birthday. So, that's all I can really say. Before we end tonight's transmission, I want to ask you all a question. Do you think Morgan and Anissa truly believed the Slender Man was real? Or do you think he became a way to explain something much deeper? Like, do you think these 12-year-olds were like in a cult trying to do a ritual? Maybe they spend way too much time on the deep web. Let me know what you think. And until next time, keep listening.